All right, we are back in Romans chapter 3. It's awful quiet in here today. I don't know what the deal is, even though I do enjoy quiet. So, where's Pete? He's usually sitting there. Do you know what's up with Pete? Okay. He was here a minute ago. Well, anyhow, let's get back to Romans chapter 2. We just started on this last week. We read the text. And before verse 17, Paul was dealing with possibly Gentiles. And now he switches gears to the Jews. And just by way of review, and when I'm talking about Jews, you understand I'm talking about those who have Jewish background who are now Christians. Does that make sense? They came out of Jewish background, but they're Christians. Yet, try to imagine in Paul's time, Christianity is just starting. You've grown up your whole life as a Jewish person with all the rituals and all the worship practices. Everything you've learned as a Jew. Now you're switching gears. And yet, Christianity is very much connected with your Jewish background. How do you know and understand how this changes? The Apostle Paul. He's going to tell them, But the Jewish people, going back prior to them becoming Christians, they had some weaknesses. Does anybody remember one of the major weaknesses? We chatted about it last week that the Jewish folks had, especially in regards to how they saw people who were not Jewish, as well as their own situation with God, how they felt about themselves. Very bigoted. That's a good word. Bigoted. Mm-hmm.
That was part of that whole story, was the disconnect between the Samaritans and the Jews.
Absolutely. Not just Samaritans, but any Gentile. Well, Samaritans were kind of a special category because they had mixed the race. And they probably hated Samaritans worse than Gentiles because of the fact that they had intermarried with Gentiles. And so, so bigotry would be an issue. Pride was an issue. The idea that they felt like simply because we're children of Abraham, we're okay. We have the law, we're okay. We have the covenant of circumcision, we're okay. Which, by the way, you got me really studying the whole concept of covenant this last week. And honestly, it's an interesting thing. Some of the things that you were mentioning were actually promises to fulfill the covenant, not covenants in themselves, such as the torch and the pot coming between the split animals was a promise that this covenant is going to be fulfilled, not the covenant in itself. And I like how one particular scholar put it. Really, in essence, there's only one covenant between God and his people. But when you break it down, you have the first covenant and the second covenant in relationship to covenant relationship with God. You have God's covenant with Noah that I'm going to make this arrangement. I'm not going to destroy the world again by a flood. And the sign of that covenant is going to be the rainbow in the sky. But ultimately, all covenants ultimately come down, the ultimate covenant comes down to God having a relationship with human beings. And that's that arrangement. But yeah, promises are different than a covenant. And that's what I got looking at. And so...
That's how I learned it. It was the five. There was two for Abraham. The king said, I'll be the father of many nations and circumcision. Those were two for him. And then Noah with the rainbow.
Yeah.
And David with that'll come down
In actuality, with Abraham, it was just a restatement of the same covenant. Yeah, it was just a restatement of his covenant relationship with his people. He had the land promise, and the people promise, but it's all within the context of one promise, or one covenant, one relational covenant. So it was fun. Thank you very much. I appreciate the questions. And so the Jewish people had a long history that they took into the church at Rome and into Christianity, where they're judging their neighbors based upon their heritage. And you could see, I think you can appreciate the struggle that they had during that transitional time, carrying all that baggage. And so what we have here is Paul in his wonderful style of asking questions. He liked to set up a straw man with questions, and then he would knock it down. So Paul's anticipating their mindset, this Jewish Christian mindset that they would have. And so he preempts their objections with questions in the letter. And so when he does that, you can almost hear them saying, hey, Paul, you're not saying that we're no different from the Gentiles, are you? I mean, come on, Paul, did you forget God gave us the law? God gave us the covenant of circumcision. Remember, we're God's chosen people. Can't you just hear them saying something like that? Paul, did you forget about that? And so in verses 17 through 24, Paul's going to deal with the law specifically. These are going to be the two major areas he covers. One, you say you're in this great relationship with God. You have this special relationship with God because you have the law. So Paul says, okay, let's deal with the law. And you say you got circumcision as this covenant relationship with God. All right, let's deal with circumcision. So in verses 25 through 29, he deals with circumcision. So let me summarize before we look at it. And basically he's saying just because you have the law and circumcision doesn't exempt you from God's judgment. You understand that, right? It does not. And he basically goes in, and his purpose of this is to demolish their religious pride and bigotry and arrogance. Okay? So let's deal with one piece of this at a time. And we'll go with verses 17 through 24 again. He says, now you, and in this particular now you, he identifies it. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and brag about your relationship with God. So, okay, so you get it? They're bragging because God gave us the law. We're better than you. We know more. We're in a better position, etc., etc. So you call yourself a Jew, and if you rely on the law to brag about your relationship with God. This is a big piece because as we're looking at Romans, we're talking about our relationship with God. We started that all the way back in Romans chapter 1 when we're looking at the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God for salvation, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. I'm talking about coming in a justified relationship before God. That's what Romans is about. How can you go and stand before such a righteous God? How can you do it? And of course, they're claiming we have better standing than you do because we have the law. Paul's saying, okay, really? And let me cut to the chase right on down the road. You think that something more than Jesus is needed to be in a just position before God? Paul is going to combat that powerfully. And he's doing it right now. You call yourself a Jew, and you're relying on the law to brag about your relationship with God. If you know His will and approve of what is superior because you're instructed by the law, see all these conditional clauses? All starting with an if. If you know His will and approve of what is superior, because you're instructed by the law. If you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish. See, because they have the law. A teacher of infants, because you have the law, the embodiment of knowledge and truth. You then, who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who brag about the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Oh, man, that last sentence must have really sent them reeling. That God's name is blasphemed because of you. Whoa. I do not want that epitaph to be on my gravestone or my person. So the law, Paul deals with it here in verse 17 through 24. And what he does, it's really interesting how he uses these conditional clauses, these 8 different verbs to describe, what's going on, the Jews and their self-confidence. You got this self-confidence. He uses these 8 different verbs in these 4 verses. You got a name if you call yourself a Jew. The name. This is this is our heritage. We're standing on our heritage. And by the way, you guys know me, right? As we're looking at Romans and we're looking at the specific situation in Rome, I'm not just thinking about what's happening in Rome. What else are we thinking about as we read this text? This isn't just a history lesson, right? What's important here that we should understand, good Bible scholars? Are we here just to be able to learn what happened in Rome? How it applies to us. Application should be paramount in this whole thing as well. But I used a statement back when we were doing the class, how to study the Bible. And it can never, as we look at the text, and we got this thing called hermeneutics. You guys remember that big word? That means the application of this text in our life today. It can never mean today what it never meant then. Remember that? So what we do is we go and we find out what's going on there. We don't have any problems here today at New Song with Jewish Christians who have pride and arrogance because of their past history with the law, the people they had dealt with, circumcision and all that. We don't have that. So how do we make application? We find out what the principle is that's going on here, lift it up, and then we can transport it through the eons and drop it in any generation. And so as we're looking at the situation, he says, now, if you call yourself a Jew and you rely on the law to brag about your relationship with God, then let me ask you some questions. All right, so what's the principle that's laying there? What's the principle that we can lift up out of this? We call that exegesis. We excise it. We cut it. We understand what those words mean. We understand what the meaning is, the principle, the teaching. Lift it up, and then we can transport it through the generations. What's the issue there? Now, there you go. All you have to do is switch it. Now, you call yourself a Christian if you rely on the what? Well, maybe it is the law. Maybe it's something else. Now, if you call yourself a Christian, that is definitely a principle. So what is it that you're identifying yourself with here? They're identifying with their Judean background, Judaism. Today, a Christian could be identifying with their Christian background. Matter of fact, you could even take it another step. You've done the universal thing, and I think it's absolutely perfectly correct, but you call yourself a Baptist, you call yourself a Presbyterian, you call yourself a non-denominational, You call yourself right? I mean, I was part of a denomination. Now, you call yourself non-denominational, and you make yourself a denomination of being non-denominational. Hard to pull out. Wait. Testing. I'm back. All righty. Very good, Roger. Okay, so let's continue with it. So you're taking that, whether you just generically call yourself a Christian or some particular denomination, or even that you're bragging because you're a non-denominational, that somehow enhances your relationship with God. And oh man, can the religious bigotry take place? And I've seen it take place. And it doesn't matter. I found out, I used to think it was this one particular group. Then I found out it's not. It's a lot of groups. Then I kind of got to find out it's not really a religious thing at all. It's a human being thing. It grows out of people.
We're all worshiping the same God, so why are we arguing about it? That's what I always thought about that denomination thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're all reading the same book, we're all worshiping the same God. Why are we arguing about how to do it?
Yeah. If in fact we are all worshiping the same God. Yeah, think about that. And that's the point that is the human being thing, is that there are things that divide us, and we use those things to divide us so that I can appear that I'm closer to God than you are. And so this was the thing. In many of Paul's letters, he's dealing with Christian unity. He's dealing with Christian unity. This is causing division. Number one, it's doctrinally wrong. Anything plus Jesus does not equal the gospel. Okay? And Paul will hammer that. By faith alone in Christ alone. Okay? And they're adding the law to it. Which this had to be severed. I mean, there was that transitionary period, but Paul is the one, and it seems to me the perfect one, to make that severance from law to grace. And he's doing that here. He has to do it. And he does it even more powerfully and vigorously in Galatians, which, by the way, I think I've mentioned it before, I'm not sure. But Galatians is what? The Reader's Digest version of Romans. It really is. It's the Cliff Notes. You can take so much of Romans and find it in a more condensed form in Galatians. So the whole God thing is huge. Theoretically, that's what it should be. Matter of fact, those who are part of the Restoration movement, that was their basic premise, that we ought to be able to take the Word of God, and we ought to be able to duplicate that form of Christianity that was found in the primitive church anywhere, anytime, any place. And then they began to form a denomination out of it. And then began to put parameters and develop their own little laws based on it. That's Tom's commentary, not necessarily all the facts. So the name, you call yourself a Jew. And then relying on the law like it's a badge. God gave us the law. We got the law. And Paul is questioning them relying on the law in this relationship with God. And that you think you've got a monopoly on the law. And that if Peter, who is this Greek, who's moved to Rome, wants to truly be in a right relationship with God, he needs to hear the gospel, he needs to believe it, He needs to repent of his past sins. He needs to confess Jesus is Lord, needs to be baptized, and then become circumcised. And then not eat pork. And obey the Sabbath. And no. No. So it's not Jesus and the law. And so Paul is dealing with this step by step. You do not have a monopoly on the law. And then he uses these questions, you say you know his will. You say you know his will. You approve of the law as being superior. And by the way, is the law good? This is something we have to keep reminding ourselves as we go through Romans. And Paul himself will deal with this issue. He deals with it in Galatians. Is the law bad? Is the law of Moses bad? Is it evil? No, the law is good. What's not good? Us. Okay? So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Because you can never meet all 600 laws or whatever, but it's a really good guideline for this law.
Guideline seems to sound optional. But let's use a law like it's 55 miles an hour through here. Is that a good guideline? Or is that the law? Because if you exceed it, the law is a good thing. Because if people go too fast, people get killed out there. I'm just using a simple example. The law is a good thing. God gives us the law because it's good for us. It keeps us within the boundaries. It's kind of like, instead of a guideline, I like to look at it like a fence. Is it good that we have these fences so kids can't get out into the street? I think it's a good thing, so they don't get harmed. And I've used my Vera's illustration with the bird that she ran into, and it was not Vera's fault. It was this bird thinking it was free, and he had escaped the cage which seemed to have restricted his freedoms. And somehow the door was left open. He was out flying around. Yeah, check me out. Vera comes along. Doom. Ugh. So maybe the parameter, that boundary that my owner was keeping in was for my own good. It was for my good. And you think that this so-called freedom was good. It wasn't. You got pegged in Vera's grill. So, it's just an illustration to show that God has the law for our good, but we're not good. We're like that bird that feels like we got to escape that and do our own thing. And so as we continue to apply this here, going back to Roger, so you call yourself a Christian. You call yourself a whatever. And you rely on your denomination. You rely on your church going. You rely on your biblical knowledge. You rely on, what are you relying on? We could take that and interpret that in a lot of different ways, and go right on down this list that Paul has made here as well. And so he talks about, you approve what's superior. You're instructed by the law. You believe, you're to be one who can teach others. And so through the law, you say you have knowledge and you have truth, right? And all these are good things. Coming to church is a good thing. That's a great thing. And taking the application for us today, and a lot of the things I mentioned are good things. But then Paul flips it on him and uses, I just use an expression that summarizes what he says. Do you practice what you preach? Do you practice what you're preaching? Are you doing what you say you rely on? Are you doing it? Or are you truly a hypocrite? And a hypocrite is a person who what? Pretends to be, let someone else finish it, who pretends to be what they never intend to be. That's a hypocrite. Not a person who makes a mistake, not a person who falls prone to sin and picks themselves up and says, turn around and get... They never intend to be. And these guys are relying on their heritage, on the law, on circumcision, et cetera, et cetera. And Paul lists it all out here. And then he says, he says, really, do you do these things? You who brag about the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? And so, you know, so now he does all those conditional clauses with those verbs saying, okay, this is what you say you are, this is what you rely on. Now he goes with his rhetorical questions, which I don't know if there's a letter of Paul's that doesn't have some rhetorical question to deal with. You know, it's like he knows what they're going to ask. He knows what the question is. He's going to raise it and deal with it. And so now he moves into these 5 rhetorical questions. So you're a teacher. All good teachers need to be a what? A learner. If you're not a learner, you cease to be a teacher. All good teachers need to be a learner. So you claim to teach. Do you learn? You who teach others, don't you teach yourself? In other words, are you a learner? Are you teaching yourself? Boy, that one hits me. You know, golly. It's one thing to stand up here and teach a class, but am I teaching myself? I remember the first time I was asked to teach a middle school class. And I taught the book of Judges. And I tell you, I learned more from that than those kids, I think, ever learned. It has to be that way. Just like last week, talking about covenant. I'm a teacher. Have I learned anything? So ask me a question, and I like to go back and learn even more about it. We should never cease to be learners. And we should be teachers by now, especially if you've been a Christian. How long have you been a Christian? Should be a teacher by now, Hebrew writer would say, after a period of time. But you need to remain a learner. Okay, so that's a general question. You're a teacher, but are you learning what you're teaching? Okay? And then he does 3 more questions that are more specific. Okay, you said stealing's bad. Do you steal? You talk about adultery as being sinful. Do you commit adultery? And you say you should stay away from idols. Do you rob temples? 3 specific questions where he's pulling out their hypocrisy. And really he's even doing more than that, because if you think you stand on the law without being you have to be perfect. You got to be perfect, because if you break one law, you're a lawbreaker. One. And so he's breaking that down. And then the 5th question is more general: is are you a lawbreaker? And so, bringing this whole text together for our application, who do we judge? And then in regards to who we judge, do we judge ourselves? Do we look at ourselves? And we who teach, are we learners as well? Because possession of the law and knowledge of the law will not make us exempt from God's judgment, as Paul's saying, and neither does circumcision, he's saying. Okay? So it's not going to be that you got the law. It's not because you have the covenant of circumcision. Okay? All right? Neither of these. So let's move on to verse 25 as he now shifts gears and deals with circumcision. He says, verse 25, circumcision has value if you observe the law. Okay? So if you're gonna rely on the law, which he's already proven, you shouldn't use that to hold up your position of being right with God. But now if you're putting so much value on circumcision, you're putting yourself in the category that law is going to make me right before God. But if you break the law, you follow this close, but if you break the law, You have become as though you have not been circumcised. Now, Paul can get a little confusing here, and we're going to summarize it in a minute. But he says, okay, you're claiming this is good. You're claiming this is what puts you in a better relationship with God. But if you break it, you realize you're a lawbreaker. And it's almost like, no, not almost like, it's like you have not been circumcised at all. Now check this out. This is where it takes a little twist in verse 26. If those who are not circumcised, who's he talking about? Gentiles. And the rest of the guys that are up there with them in Rome. Keep this in mind. If those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? Interesting. Now, please, you got to try to hear that from this Jewish background. All right? Oh, he hasn't even gotten there yet. But yes, he's very bold.
This stuff here is like, I don't know. This is like a black handwriting to the KKK.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? This is like, he's coming into a place where people are like, everybody's bad but the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And he's saying, you know, you're wrong, and I'm gonna confront you about it.
It's actually a very good comparison, the racial thing. So in verse 27, then, he says, the one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you. Who? Even though you have the written code and the circumcision, you're a lawbreaker. A man is not a Jew if he's only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not the written code. Such a man's praise is not from men, but from God. So Paul is taking, check this out, Paul is taking the definition of what it means to be Jewish, and he's flipping it on in. He's changing it completely from something that is outward, physical, to something that's inward and spiritual. So, yeah, circumcision was a sign and a seal of God's covenant with them, but it wasn't some insurance policy for all time to keep them from God's wrath, because even though in the system, the Old Testament system, the first covenant, circumcision was part of the law, but it still required obedience. You couldn't just say, hey, we circumcised old, young Abraham here at 8 days of age. He's good to go the rest of his life. He do whatever you want. He still needed to obey the law. All right? I mean, the Jewish folks almost had it down to be something that was actually superstitious in regards to circumcision. Like that was the only thing. There is a group that does the same thing with baptism. And that's nothing new. That goes all the way back to Constantine. And he almost saw baptism, which had already been established for 3 centuries, as kind of this mysterious rite that now made everything right with people. And so I think I shared with you before, he forced marched his army through a river to get them baptized. And this is kind of the Jews' way of thinking in regards to circumcision. You just get circumcised and, we're good. You just get baptized and you're good. Yes. Kind of, without the law connotation. I mean, but yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. I like F. LaGard Smith. He wrote a book called Baptism, the believer's wedding ceremony. So more of that covenant relationship with Jesus expressed through a ceremony of baptism. He's written a whole book on it. Matter of fact, it's really really kind of cool. So I like that, but I've never looked at it before. But yeah, I have actually. is kind of similar to circumcision, as that the only difference is it's law versus grace. Our motivation for baptism is different than what they had their motivation for circumcision. Again, law versus grace, which is Romans. So, oh yeah, or the second covenant, as I like to call it. But Paul understands everything about circumcision. He understands that it originated with God as a sign of his first covenant, again, which included obedience to the law. So here's the little formula that Paul's putting together. He's basically saying circumcision minus obedience is equal to not being circumcised at all. And then he's saying that obedience, I could begin with it. Obedience plus not being circumcised is equal to being circumcised. And does Paul, at this point in his life, care anything at all about physical circumcision? No, it means nothing. He's using it currently as a metaphor for removal of that which is old and not good and embracing a new relationship with God. But imagine these Jewish Christians hearing what Paul's saying in regards to something that they hold so sacred, so superstitiously, and he's basically saying, these Gentiles are going to judge you. Whoa! What are you talking about, Paul? What are you talking about? Don't you remember our heritage? Don't you remember who we are? We're the chosen people. You know, in to use your example, Don, it's this role reversal that's going on. It's the pagan, not the Jews, that now are in God's favor in light of their obedience to him. But Paul's turning it upside down on them. And I got about a minute left. Verse 29. No man is a Jew if he's one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, capital S. He's talking about the Holy Spirit, not the written code. So 29 really captures this whole thing that's going on here, that he's attempting, I think very powerfully, to make this cut from this whole connection of being justified by those things that are law and those things that were previously a part of Judaism. He's saying we're making a divide, we're making a separation. And here's the thing I want to leave you with for our homework next week. What does Paul mean when he says that it's circumcision of the heart? What's he talking about, the circumcision of the heart? By the Spirit. And which, by the way, find me a couple Old Testament passages that deal with that. This isn't a new phrase that Paul just invented. God had already dealt with this in dealing with his people in the Old Testament. Okay? La, you writing it down? Oh, you are awesome. So, what is this whole circumcision of the heart thing? What does that mean? And how does the Holy Spirit do that? And what's that got to do with the written code versus circumcision of the heart? Because, here's the last statement, such a man's praise is not from men, but from God. God's praising you when you understand this circumcision of the heart thing. You've been circumcised of the heart. And by the way, instead of the Old Testament covenant sign of male circumcision, this circumcision of heart is for men and women, right? For all God's people. So you be ready next week. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.